everyone, I'm Ishitwa. I use he, him pronouns. Looking forward to a great debate.
DJ.
Hello everyone, I'm DJ Ugolino from UPLB, he, him, pronouns. Good luck.
Jagannath.
Hi, my pronouns would be he/him. Best of luck for the debate.
Okay, so with those introductions, hello everyone. Welcome to the grand finals of this year's VIV, and congratulations for making this far. Again, hi, I'm Nicole Uto from UPLB, the chair for this round, and my preferred gender pronouns are she and they. So this round's motion reads, this House believes that the Philippine opposition should employ a campaign based on issues as opposed to an anti-Duterte campaign. But okay, before that, do anyone in the gov or in opposition do not consent to live streaming?
All of gov consents.
Okay.
All of op consents, but maybe on my behalf, could you just like put like a little blurb, like this is the positions are assigned to people and stuff like that.
Okay. Okay. So just a few reminders before we start this debate. You may introduce yourselves and mention your preferred gender pronouns if you have any, and please mention your preferred way of receiving POIs. Additionally, the orgcom will be sending timestamps in the chat, so thank you so much for that. Without further ado, calling on Prime Minister to start this debate. Here.
Hi, can everyone see and hear me?
Yep.
Perfect. For POIs, I guess if you can, preferably turn on your camera. Maybe like if you raise your hand on Zoom, or like bump yourself up so I can see you. Otherwise, chat is fine. I guess before I start, just want to do a couple of thank yous because I guess that's pretty customary. I want to thank our opponents, also like our teammates. This is going to be Connor's last debate tournament, I think, unless Connor decides to debate again. So I don't know. I've never met Connor in person because I went to school online the past semester, but it's been really great debating with you, Connor. And I'm glad that this will be our final round. It'll be great. Cool. All right. My speech starts in 3, 2, 1. I was a bit confused about why opposition vetoed motion 3, and then I thought about it during prep and realized that one of the only things my partner knew about the Philippines was something not about the Philippines at all. That's why I realized we might lose this motion. But anyways, we're going to give it our best shot. I'm going to talk about 3 things. Number 1, what is the debate about? I think the metric of this debate is what the opposition party ought to care about, probably being things, for example, like spreading influence, but also things, for instance, like trying to usurp existing establishment parties and as a result of that getting to positions of power. So that's probably the debate. We're going to forward 2 arguments. Number 1, I'm going to talk about why it's significantly easier to accrue a critical mass when you run on issue-based politics as compared to an anti-Duterte platform. Second of all, I'm going to meaningfully tell you why even in the instances in which you fail, this is more significant at doing things like creating sustainable change. Before that, the first thing I want to flag out is what the comparative therefore is on our side of the house. So I think opposition side will probably support things like the status quo, in which the opposition party is vehemently opposed to Duterte and actively campaigns on the basis of that. So saying things, for example, like you need to vote for us because we hate Duterte, for instance, things of that nature. The comparative on our side is you focus on collective action issues, for instance. So things, for example, like solving COVID and making sure COVID relief is better. Things, for example, like better welfare and educational reforms, things of those natures. Pretty much, generally speaking, just issues that people are concerned with and issues that people care about. Great. First argumentation, why it's significantly easier on our side of the house to gain a critical mass. There are 2 things I want to flag out. The first thing I want to flag out, and Connor made me aware of this, so thank you, Connor, is that Duterte is legally ineligible to run as a result of the structure of Filipino politics. This is important because I would posit, therefore, that any anti-Duterte policy on opposition or any anti-Duterte platform is relatively futile to the point in which you're targeting an individual that literally cannot run, and as a result of that, even if you try to implicitly use that as a means to target their successors, no thank you, I think it is comparatively less effective because Duterte is probably going to be a different individual as the appointed successor, for instance, or any other opposition leader. That's the first thing I want to flag out. The second thing I want to flag out is the issue within Filipino politics across the century. We would posit on government, even though we're a bunch of internationals, that the issue with Filipino politics is that the vast majority of individuals are probably disillusioned with it for 2 distinct reasons. The first reason is because of the viscerality of harm that you see on the ground. So things, for example, like ineffective bureaucracies that lead to policies not being implemented, that leads to things, for example, like individuals still suffering and day-to-day life become comparatively harder. Things like that makes it so that people do not think government and politics can meaningfully make a change on the ground. But second of all, I think it is the culture of like blaming one specific individual and rallying on campaigns that are politician or anti-existing elected officials. The reason as to why that came to be is because if you look at the rise of contemporary Filipino politics, right? After the De Marcos regime, what happened, according to Connor, so if it's wrong, blame him, not me, what happened was that two different oligarchic families came to rise, and they've been jostling for power through things like economic and political strongholds. What that necessarily meant was that the existence of competing with each other and therefore directly attacking the other individual as compared to doing things, for example, like actively passing policies or discussing meaningful issues. So what ends up happening as a result of that is people increasingly grow disillusioned with the system because they don't think the system meaningfully talks about issue-based politics that are important, but rather just slanders other individuals at that. Great. What then changes on our side of the house in terms of impacting? The first thing I want to flag out as to what changes, David, I'll take you after these impacting. The first thing I want to flag out is you're able to more meaningfully capture a critical mass. Because if you talk about issues that are important, people probably care about said issues, and therefore they're more likely going to vote for you as an opposition. Because the issue right now is when you're just advocating on an anti-Duterte platform, it is relatively abstract as to what necessarily you are doing. But the comparative on our side is when you are able to appeal to the individuals on the ground by saying, we're going to solve X problem because we know you've been struggling with X problem, people are more likely going to vote for you because they find you relatable and palatable. So you're able to gain a critical mass by the individual that has been disillusioned. And the comparative for those individuals uniquely is that they probably do things like not vote, so we're uniquely able to capture that. That allows us to do things like gain a critical mass that's going to be significant. But second of all, I think you also limit the extent of backlash coming from the likes of Duterte. So even though Duterte cannot legally run, he as an individual can still, for example, criticize the opposition as he has done right now in status quo. So the issue when you blatantly run on an anti-Duterte policy or a platform is that you get significant amounts of backlash coming from him and his cronies. The comparative is you can just say, we don't care about Duterte, we care about solving these issues, we will solve these issues better. That means you're able to circumvent a significant portion of political backlash and therefore able to create more significant degrees of political unity as well. But the final thing I want to posit is why this is important, because the issue right now is that Duterte has created a cult of personality. So you are probably unable to beat that cult of personality down. Anytime you try to attack that, it's going to be seen as an active attack on Duterte. And as a result of that, people that otherwise supported Duterte are not likely going to vote for you. Insofar as Duterte is not going to be able to run for election, if you say we're going to solve the issues you care about, these are individuals that might sway from voting for Duterte to voting for the opposition. The comparative is that you never get that because you actively antagonize Duterte, which is seen as the hero within their eyes. Before I go on to the second argument, yeah, David.
It's a probably bad idea to blame many structural issues because of the fact that many of these people were in power the term before Duterte or even in term now, which means that they're also partially responsible for the issues they created.
Right. So I think if you do that, then it's going to be good, right? Because then you're seen as admitting the mistakes in your past. I think that POI is non-comparative though, because a lot of the harms you want to talk about under that POI probably become symmetric. Like if you say we hate Duterte, like presumably the call out is also going to be, but you were in term around him as well. So why didn't you do anything about it? So I think that's symmetric. Great. So the impact of this first argument is that it's more significantly easier on our side of the house to create a critical mass. And therefore, as a result of that, the opposition is more likely going to be in positions of power because you tap into individuals that are disillusioned and otherwise would not have voted. Second argumentation, why it's also important in the long run. So even if you don't buy that first argument, so let's assume like we lose the election by a landslide. Why is that still good for the opposition? The first reason is because you create a new renewed platform and PR messaging for the opposition. So the opposition is no longer a party that just runs on an anti-establishment or anti-certain president platform, but rather you have specific issues that you want to talk about that can be used to tap into long-term PRing that is uniquely important. Because the comparative is every time you get a new president, you need to change your platform to like be an anti-X or anti-Y. On our side of the house, you create sustainable platform. It's also probably easier to do things like retain votership as a result of that. But second of all, I think it is good because you at least force the existing establishment to engage with your issue. So the individuals on the ground feel as though you're the party that is going to bring justice to people. Because the comparative, when you just say it's anti-Duterte, then the Duterte party is going to say, oh, we're anti-opposition. So you just get this really toxic deadlock. On our side, when you say this is about education or about economy or about any other issue, you force the opposition to answer those issues. And as a result of that, you at least progress discourse in meaningful ways that you never will do on the comparative. This gives people hope that change can happen, and therefore they're going to want to support you. For all those reasons, we got better change on our side. Very happy to propose.
Thank you for that fine speech. Now to introduce the case of opposition, leader of the opposition. Yeah.
Hi, can I be heard? Okay, I'll take POIs in chat. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Perhaps the only way to unite a fractious and diverse Philippine opposition is to employ an anti-Duterte campaign as opposed to an issues-based campaign that people already disagree on. 3 things. First, housekeeping. So the clear the clear enemy we're trying to fight is the Sara Duterte, Rodrigo Duterte slate, where Duterte has expressed a desire to run for vice president and his daughter is running for president. So I also want to identify that other people we want to criticize or include within our scope of the campaign are those who are also heavily involved in the administration, like Bongo or Harry Roque. What are we doing specifically? Our main priority is the critique of Rodrigo Duterte as the reason for many structural problems in the Philippines, the failure of the COVID response, the creation of a system that kills poor people in alleyways, and the suppression of free political dissent. And we're willing to take the trade-off. We're okay with being less clear about how we solve poverty, corruption, and it is precisely that clarity that fractures a coherent opposition and allows a vicious PDP Laban to take advantage. Second part of the speech, response. So the first thing I want to respond to is them saying Duterte's not going to run. Yeah, he's not going to run for president. He's going to run for vice president. Also, the Supreme Court is majority Duterte appointees. They will not vote to make him ineligible, by the way. So, secondly, they then say, well, Duterte will do a bunch of stuff. They will criticize the opposition and they'll engage with your issue. The first thing is, if they criticize the opposition, then they will clearly make it such that your issue is unimportant, or they will make it seem like it is your fault, as we identify in the POI. So it's not clear whether or not this achieves any meaningful solvency. But secondly, they then say, well, people are disillusioned. Like the Hacienda Luisita massacre will make you look terrible. Admitting to your mistakes, in fact, makes everything worse because now you're liable to do things like, again, get the blame heaped on you. They're saying if you admitted your mistakes, then clearly we'll just take someone else because we can't trust you to be in power. But notably, they will also blame you for getting in the way in Senate by blocking their bills or being too critical of the attempts of government. More importantly, there's also a lot of disagreement between internal to the Philippine opposition on what the issues actually are. The Philippine left and opposition are super duper divided on whether or not they want Christianity to be prominent in the Philippines, whether or not they want economic growth and liberalize the economy, or hardcore agrarian reform and increase on rent controls and things like that. Every additional issue is a polarizing topic to be attacked by the vicious PDP Laban, but more importantly, is likely to split the vote as you offer up several different candidates on the slate, which is exactly what happened with Poe and Rojas in 2016. They then say it's symmetric as a response to the I'll explain this, but the first thing is, this is not symmetric for the reason that on their side, the blame is shared for failures in certain issues, and when we attempt to criticize Duterte on their side, they look hypocritical. On our side, we foist the blame onto Duterte by identifying him and concentrating on him as the main reason for many of these issues, which is why an issues-based offense is unlikely to succeed, and in fact, weaken the Philippine opposition, both in terms of a cohesive voter base, but also in terms of the actual amounts of votes each individual candidate will get. I want to then bring up the comparative. Why is it the case that one, the cult of personality will not happen on their side, and then secondly, why our strategy is substantially more likely to succeed? Firstly, why is this an opportune time to criticize Duterte? I want to note that he only had his cult of personality when he was a person in power, but in the election, he only had 33% of the vote. And now the election is coming again, and so many different people who want to become president have an active incentive to galvanize support against Duterte because they have their own political ambitions. Some of his most loyal supporters are starting to finally dissociate from him, like Manny Pacquiao, one of his biggest supporters, is now becoming a huge critic of Duterte since he also wants to become president or vice president. But notably, you would not have many of these things if they decided instead to focus on issues instead of solidifying with the Philippine offense and focusing on criticizing Duterte. Notably, Duterte is also waning in support. COVID-19 was handled pretty badly, the healthcare system is crumbling, and the economy was ravaged with lockdown without any support. Nearing the end of its term, he has fulfilled almost none of his promises, like not kicking out China of the West Philippine Sea, not removing drug lords, and not implementing federalism. But the problem is that failing to take advantage of these things allows the public to forget about them and allows them to not be an important issue in the coming elections. Why is then our side substantially more likely to succeed? I'll take you after this point. But the first is that en masse, we get more supporters, and more people are willing to support us come election time. Why? In 3 ways. The first is that a lot of people were disenfranchised during Duterte's term, have had a loved one die, have starved or lost their jobs to an administration focused more on jet skis and dolomite than on real people's lives. This is a vivid, potent way to harness that energy in a few key ways. The first is that this speaks to people, which means we get support because this is just one of the things that people all agree on, even if they don't agree on any individual issue. The second is that this energizes people. Election in and election out, people have been told and sold the lie of prosperity, of lasting peace and corruption. The nature nature of Philippine politics is that every year someone comes up with a solution, they get into power, and then they don't do anything about it. People are now disillusioned and will not easily believe appeals to incremental progress for a particular issue, since time and time again that has failed. Instead, we sell the fear that another killer in the presidential chair may come back for another 6 years, and this is what motivates people out of their apathy and decide to come to the ballot box. But the third and most important thing is that this shoves blame. That this is the converse of the point we mentioned earlier, which is that Duterte will try and blame you on either side since he wants to win the election, so you don't want to just accept the blame and admit it. You instead want to focus it on him, making it harder for him to gain political advantage from your weakness. This means that the Philippine opposition is way more likely to win in terms of electoral strategy. I'll engage with the worst possible case later, but I will take the POI from Chang. Go.
So if that's your characterization, then people probably already know Duterte is doing a poor job. The question then becomes, how would you solve the mess Duterte has left behind? How would saying Duterte is horrible tell people what you want to do?
So this misses one, the last sentence where I said this doesn't happen anymore if you get to smooth things over by focusing on issues. Secondly, we said if you focus on issues, the Philippine opposition fractures. So Duterte can take advantage of that. So this is exactly why it's not mutually exclusive, and in fact, why things get better on our side. Note, engaging on the worst case, even if we don't win the presidency, there's a significant incentive for people to collaborate with us since there's a shared anti-Duterte sentiment, which means that we do get cooperation to block bad bills in Senate and Congress, and we start to build mainstream parties that work with the left and the right, which is what Once I'm Buying is doing, and by the way, I hate that name. But thirdly is that even if we don't win, as long as Duterte doesn't win, this is what really matters to us. To be clear, having Duterte not in power is more important than any liberal change, since the damage he wreaked on this country and will continue to wreak is undeniable, putting in some of his most extreme policies like pulling out of the ICC instead of cooperating with other states, the imprisonment of political enemies like Laila de Lima, and the shoddy response to coronavirus, and a bureaucracy rife with corruption. We want to set a clear precedent that authoritarianism in the Philippines will immediately be responded to with a concerted attempt to destroy any return to political life. Weighing. Our reasons are more nuanced, since even if issues-based campaigns are effective in general, they are not and will not be effective for a Philippine voter base disillusioned with the promise of progress. Our reasons are analytically prior, since even if issues are important, unless we take advantage of the opportunity to destroy Duterte's cult of personality, no matter what issues you bring up, Duterte's voter base will always be more energized unless we can divide his base and ruin his public image. Our reasons are more powerful, our case is more powerful, and our ballot is clearly opposition-sided. Oppose.
Thank you for that fine speech. Now to extend the case of affirmative DPM.
All right. Howdy, y'all. I don't know where my phone went. There it is. Okay. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. Begin time. 3, 2, 1. Now. Right. I think that one thing here, in the realm of what this debate is that, right, that there's a crisis in Filipino democracy. Here's the thing, though, is that I think that if you look at basically how we are able to project the future and which side will be able to better win or not, I think that where Gov wins. I think we're going to provide to you a reason why we think the opposition stands the best chance by focusing on issues that matter to individuals. But then secondly, why even if they lose and even if they get destroyed, why it's still important in the long run for the long run health of Filipino democracy that these parties do this. Right. Okay. So first, when they talk about how right that all the issues that currently exist are blamed on opposition parties already. But I think that this is exactly what it is that if they're already blamed on opposition parties, these are symmetric, which means that if you embrace the notion that if we go anti-Duterte, that people will just forget about this, I don't think that that's true, because I think that these parties have been maligned with this. The better push instead of saying that we are these parties and we want to oppose Duterte, which the problem is that if you created conditions that allowed Duterte to rise, what's to say you won't do that again? And instead focus on issues that focus the Philippines towards the future. And that we think that these personal attacks are worse, because it means that there is a much easier way for Duterte to directly pull himself into the issues, rather than a campaign, for example, that focuses on how the Philippines can best recover from COVID-19 and how it can focus on, for example, vaccinating rural populations. One that directly targets and blames Duterte means that he is a direct line into the exact attacks that are being leveled against him. By focusing merely on the issues, this kind of link is not as clear, and it not only allows for opposition parties on the left to focus on different kind of issues other than Duterte, but it also allows for opposition politicians on the right to do their own thing to oppose Duterte internally. by breaking apart this link. But I think that what opposition wants to say is that breaking this link is bad. But there's a problem here, right? Because they say that they split the opposition as the secondary response. The problem is that if these issues, there's a larger issue here if these parties can't agree to work together. Because what the motion is ultimately saying here is what these parties should necessarily be running on, but it doesn't necessarily say what they should be negotiating on behind the scenes. We can believe both that in public, these parties ought to be negotiating, but on the issues of pocketbook matters or on things that matter to the individual that themselves can be abstract, whether it be better infrastructure or whether it be education or better sanitation management. But what happens behind the scenes that we think that we can still advocate for and is not mutually exclusive is that these parties should be negotiating for candidates to drop out or candidates to coalesce around each other without necessarily making it around an anti-Duterte candidate. Because I think that if it is true that every single party has its problems, no single party will be able to properly oppose it without creating its own cult of personality issue. And this leads me kind of into what the importance for the long-run health of Filipino democracy is, in that while there is a clear enemy here, and while Duterte, and that nothing matters more than defeating Duterte, and I get this, the problem in the long run thing is that we here cannot ultimately predict which side will win this debate. So I think that if you take it such that in a worst case scenario, all the opposition parties get absolutely destroyed, and Duterte is now the vice president, his daughter's the president again. What is important for the long-term health of Filipino democracy is that the parties that ran on an anti-Duterte campaign have something to talk about during the Duterte presidency, rather than just turning every single issue into a polarizing issue about whether or not this is Duterte's thing. What it allows parties to do in a post-Duterte victory is it allows them to criticize particular parts of education or particular parts of crime that don't necessarily come off as personal attacks of Duterte or the policies that he had. I get that this is not an ideal future and that this is an awful future for many to consider. The problem here is that if they cannot win, then they need to find a way to properly exist within a Duterte administration and focus on issues to still help the majority of Filipino people. And if it means moderating on this issue so that they can still work on issues without creating polarization and injecting individual personalities into every single political issue, I think you are better able to achieve this result. Right. So what a further extension that I'm going to forward here is that it's not only that it helps solve for the other issue that is brought up on the opposition side about how these parties are seen as the root of as fundamentally corrupted or is the problem of the past. Because I think that what our side does is that by focusing on these issues, now and in the future, you're able to better change not only the political composition of your voters, but you're also able to change the political composition of those who run for office under your banner and the party bureaucrats and the party infrastructure that you create that I think is absolutely essential to a functioning democracy. Because I think that this exists even if the opposition loses and even if it wins. Because the kinds of individuals who join these parties are, aside from voters, city officials, party bureaucrats, and so forth. These are long-run impacts that have, because they will be the future leaders of these kinds of parties. And you want to attract individuals who have issue expertise, not necessarily individuals whose sole issue is just opposition to Duterte, which is absolutely important. I do not deny that, but it attracts a certain kind of people that may be social media savvy, but may be lacking on a lot of specific technical ideas on how to actually improve systems that benefit or detract from the everyday lives of Filipino citizens. So you get the ability to have specialists in accounting, agriculture, industrial policy, and so forth. And when they later run for representatives, you get a stronger party in the future that can better solve for these issues, but I'll take the POI.
So surely we could just run the same backroom discussion response you mentioned here. But I think the more important thing is that if there is an awful future, surely the best way to make this less bad is to hold them accountable more often by galvanizing voters and making it harder for them to do things.
Yes, the problem here, so there's a twofold response to that. The first is that I think that the best way to win is by not focusing necessarily on how bad it is. And I understand that this is a big threat to democracy, but I also understand that Duterte still remains decently popular enough such that he is a threat to winning the election. If this is the case, what it means is that it is likely that large chunks of voters have identified that Duterte has failed on a lot of issues. As the opposition mentions themselves, a lot of the things that voters are turning against Duterte for are policy failures. if that is the case, and that is the reason that they're turning against Duterte, the best thing that the opposition can do is identify these policy failures and drive in on them and focus on how they will focus on these policy issues and make them better, rather than seeing a policy issue that people are turning away from Duterte from and then attacking Duterte. I get that he's the cause of the problem, but ultimately, if you're trying to convince people who like Duterte, then this is the best way to do so. Because voters don't like admitting they were wrong. If they were a Duterte supporter initially, and you tell them that they are a fundamental threat to democracy by linking every single thing that's wrong in the Philippines to Duterte, they become much more defensive reflexively. But if instead you focus and say, we just want to build better schools, we want to improve Filipino infrastructure, they're far more likely to vote for you because the guard is much lower. I think you're able to impact long-run Filipino democracy, but you also stand the best chance at defeating Duterte in the upcoming presidential election. Thank you.
Thank you for that fine speech. Now to extend negatives case, DLO, here.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
Alright, great. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. First question. Why are issues a losing ground for the Philippine opposition? Gov is very good at making it seem like issues are just looking at the problems. The problem is that a lot of issues-based discussion is also talking solutions, and that's where the trouble starts to lie. The first thing I want to point out is, why did Duterte win to begin with? Because Duterte ran on an issues-based platform. And the reason that he will always win when it comes to a discussion of issues is if you want to say, I will stop corruption, I will stop crime, I will fight China, the reason Duterte is far more convincing than the Philippine opposition, because for years, people have been left out of structural problems and structures in society. And what Duterte did was he provided an incredibly simple solution to all of it. He said, to stop crime, I will have a war on drugs. To stop political dynasties, we need to have federalism. To stop the hegemon of China, I will ride a jet ski and go out into the sea. The problem is that these are incredibly bad solutions, but they speak to the average person. The opposition does not have that kind of benefit for a couple reasons. Firstly, the solutions are incredibly divisive. Maybe you can say the Philippines needs to reform economically. Some members of the opposition will say you need to liberalize markets, you need to make sure more people are investing in the country. Some members of the Philippine opposition will say, no, we need more socialized platforms, things like agricultural reform. And from that point alone, you don't even have assured unification of this movement in and of itself. But the second thing is that it is incredibly difficult to understand. The average person will not be able to fully explain comprehensive agricultural reform. People would not understand, why the hell would you decriminalize drugs? These are things that are bad when Lenny talked about them. Not only does this turn people away, it reinforced the idea that the opposition are a set of elitist technocrats who are the rich and will only ensure they leave out the masses far more into the future. So, even if you can agree on what the problems are, it is Duterte who knows exactly what solutions appeal to the most people. And either GovBench has solutions that are also incredibly bad and therefore I don't know why that's good, or they use the current solutions the opposition is trying to make use of that are currently very, very difficult for the average person to think about. At best, they say that you should be able to create a coalition, but their mechanism for this is you should encourage other candidates to drop out. Number one, the number of candidates that exist right now are as a result of incredibly politically ambitious individuals who want the seat of presidency. On their side, if they wanted to drop out, there's no way in hell they want to give up this position. But they may be more willing to make concessions insofar as we both agree. If you guys trash Duterte, we will do the same. That's precisely what's working with a lot of the people who were formerly in PDP Laban or Duterte's party that are now starting to dissociate because they want to become president and also want to say Duterte was at fault for many different things. Secondly, why is it that the anti-Duterte kind of blame works? Firstly, they don't explain why you suddenly wanting to solve the solutions that you, the problems that you brought around is likely to work. In fact, because the problems that they discuss cannot be blamed on Duterte, the next possible alternative are the same oligarchs that were jostling for power that the Prime Minister talks about. I.e., the opposition is incredibly reminiscent of the Aquino administration, incredibly reminiscent of past and previous structural problems like Coco Levy and historical scandals that were associated with corruption. Why is that important? Because if you say, I will try and fix these problems, you don't come off as, finally they will fix these problems. You come off as hypocritical. You come off as untrustworthy. And therefore, instead, saying these problems did not come from us, but came from Duterte is at the very least far more likely to be convincing as a result. But secondly, there is the new face to the anti-Duterte movement. Because in 2016, Duterte was framed to be a political outsider, the first person who will listen to people from Mindanao, the first person who speaks the language of the average man. That is no longer true today, because this new Duterte ballot with both Sara and Rodrigo is far less convincing for the average person, and being able to galvanize hatred against that is powerful. Why? A couple of reasons. Firstly, look at the trend of like a lot of Philippine like cities, counties now trying to take down political dynasties, i.e. in Pasig, i.e. in Manila. I think even Lauren Lagarde was able to win over a significant political dynasty. What I'd like to point out here is that while Duterte was framed out as a political outsider, this new ticket can be framed as a historical, like him just wanting to be able to grab onto power, him being an incredibly selfish politician that did not actually care about the common man, but instead just wanted to be able to hold on to power. And by being able to galvanize that kind of anger, you can switch these people to the opposition. But moreover, Rodrigo Duterte explicitly said, I will run for VP because I want immunity so that people cannot put me to jail. A lot of people have been incredibly turned off by that statement because it shows that his interest in politics is one that is solely based on its political gain as opposed to caring about you as an individual person. What that proves, therefore, is that the ability to switch people and ensure that that anger is galvanized is actually far more relatable, far more likely to anger and energize a base, as opposed to issues and discussions which are often difficult for the average person to comprehend, difficult because it divides the movement and therefore do not push you to go to the ballot box. I'll take a POI from Gov now.
If your characterization is true and that these other opposition parties have fundamental differences to working together on issues, but that Duterte also poses a fundamental threat to democracy, why are they not able to work together? If he is as big of a threat as you say he is.
Oh, no. What I'm saying is that all of them want to become president, and therefore there's a significant consolidated base that wants to take down Duterte. So there are two options here. Either this means that the opposition takes over, or it is not Duterte nor the opposition that takes over. In that case, they've already explained, even if we cannot win the presidency, it is an increased number of places in cabinet, an increased number of seats within legislation, and a degree of local governments that we might be able to win over. But at the very least is a semblance of power and control for the opposition group that currently has very little in status quo. Lastly, let's say we don't win. Why is this still okay? Because we put Sara Duterte in a very difficult position. She is now going to receive flack for association with her father from both the opposition as well as the many other people trying to criticize Duterte like Manny Pacquiao, etc. There are two things she's likely to do. Firstly, she could preemptively not select her father as her running mate, and therefore the ability to ensure there's a significant check and balance, because even if other people are not great, Duterte is probably the worst option out of all of them. Any other person that she picks to be vice president is far better. But secondly, she might allow that to translate into policy, i.e. convincing everyone that she wants to distance herself from her father, that she is a reformer, that she is not everything that they thought her father was, and that the sins of the father are not the sins of the daughter. It is much easier therefore to have her turn away from the most unpopular parts of Duterte's policy. So she's probably not going to be great, but at the very least decreasing the amount of casualties of the war on drugs, ensuring that there's a better COVID response that might exist as a result, rather than Duterte who tried to deny the problem, and moreover, active distancing from her father who has wreaked havoc on the nation. Even if we don't win, it is this kind of pressure that I'd say is still a winning fight. I'm incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. Now calling on GovWhip. Here.
Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Clear, yeah? Okay. POI, please just send it through chat. I will definitely get to you. Or actually, just turn on your video. Let's do a bit of meta framing. The debate was a value judgment and must be metricized on its potential impacts for the Philippines and the evolution of the opposition party to cater more towards the needs of the people. Issues that are more urgent, like COVID, media freedoms, education, and other generalities that my PM and DPM already talked about. We gave you a reason for why long term will be likely better for this opposition party, and we explained to you how we get a stronger base and also better politicians overall. I'm going to talk about two things. The first, why do you get critical mass exclusively on our side? And secondly, why is this better for the party's future trajectory? Firstly, why do you get critical mass? And under this, I want to respond to three of the claims from opposition. The first is that issue-based discussions are talking solutions, and therefore people will dislike you because you're just talking. I think socialization of issues is highly cathartic and beneficial for the vast majority of people and vast majority of voters. It is thus easier to tap into their interests through this mechanism, and therefore we actually got more critical mass on our side of the house, as it is more visceral and actually you tap into what they think are important issues in their lives. Secondly, they said to me that issues-based offenses are blamed on the opposition. And for that reason, it is unlikely that you can reverse this by just talking about issues like more and more. And this comes out from the LO speech. I've got three responses against this. Firstly, if that's true, it's more necessary to pump political capital to showing things that you've been able to fix or methods of fixing those into the future. If a lot of the attacks towards you as the opposition party is that you aren't able to fix a lot of things, you have to prove that you can fix those things, and you have to prove that you have mechanisms and solutions to fix those things into the future. So I think if the context from LO holds true, we were able to actually fix that on our side of the house. Secondly, all points me to a reason for why people potentially dislike the opposition party. If the blame is largely put on the opposition party, there's much more political capital that says you're in the wrong. You need to fix that image first rather than paint yourself as a lesser evil, because we point to you that it's likely to create even more disillusionment within you, like versus Duterte overall, right? But thirdly, even if painting yourself as a lesser evil can be done on the opposition, assuming the best case scenario, it doesn't matter because you never prove yourself as a better comparative to voters. They get disillusioned even more, thus conceding to our point that people are less likely to vote for you, even if they are agreeing with you that Duterte is a bad person or a bad leader for that country. Then the final thing they told me was that this fixes fracturing in Filipino politics. One response against this, the premise here was that people are annoyed at politicians for doing nothing. You upscale this harm more on opposition when politicians engage with each other more rather than people on the ground and rather than their issues. No, thank you. This flips the only premise of that LO speech, that the Filipino demographic cannot be catered towards with just the bad things Duterte has done, or has done as a citizen already knows about that. So what this means is that the fracturing exists more on their side of the house. We prove to you how you fix that fracturing on our side of the house through structural mechanisms. I want to weigh this in three different ways. Firstly, all provides context to prove disillusionment, and they think that this is a way for them to win the debate. We use that context against them by explaining that focusing on the entrenchment of problems and potential of change will bring them out of that disillusionment. The context itself isn't a tipping point in the round. But number two, OP doesn't engage with our cult of personality point. You are significantly more likely to lose against Duterte. Duterte has just significantly more capital than you politically and financially, has a higher volume of smear campaigns on you, as LO concedes to in the context as well, so you will likely lose more on the opposition bench. But thirdly, even if OP is able to successfully produce the same amount of smear campaigns as Duterte does, this is unlikely to benefit you anyway, as people would see both of you as bad, so at best you get either voter apathy or you get less government seats as no one knows what you're supposed to be offering to them at this time of crisis or at times where they're completely disillusioned by the state. This means two things. The first is that moderates are much more likely to side with Duterte with oppositions, like our policy specifically, just because they're more likely to side with the opposition party just because they're more likely to be able to show why their policies are likely good. But two, even if you don't buy that, all of OP's characterization proves to us that you don't need to allocate any more political capital to saying Duterte is bad. You must allocate more to showing why you're better on general issues like education and infrastructure. That wins us the first clash, and yeah, I'll take David.
Yeah, Gov can only benefit from the benefit of solving issues and looking like they solve issues if people agree on the necessary solutions. Like if push came to shove, would you or would you not impose agrarian reform?
I don't know. I don't really care about that. The point here is that if it's only about generally socializing individuals to understand that those benefits can exist, or understand that you as a party are able to prove that towards individuals. And this is the worst case scenario, by the way, that your DLO kind of imposes upon us by saying that you're only going to socialize about those issues. We've proved to you why, even if it's just socialization, it is still likely to gain a critical mass that is the entryway for you to be aimed to having the capacity to actually fix those problems in the Philippines. Thus, on a value judgment, it is better on the proposition bench. I want to now talk about the second question. Why is this better for the party's future trajectory? And under this, I want to respond to four different things from the opposition bench. The first idea was that Duterte is a politician who's been talking about issues, and therefore you're probably going to disillusion people even further, or you're not going to be able to get long-term benefits just because people are going to see you as outlandish. But if that is true, the better way to prove you are a preferable alternative is to show you're not as outlandish and you're not mired with lunacy. You create a stronger base on our side of the house. And notice that there are probably incentives for the opposition party to not claim the things that Duterte is claiming, because at that point it's kind of like a pretty weird policy to begin with. On our side of the house, you are more likely to sound more realistic, and for that reason, you are probably going to be able to show yourself as a better comparative than Duterte. Then they told me that you as a party will look untrustworthy if you promise things. Look, the veil of untrustworthiness is more likely insofar as you play the blame game. This is because you end up playing into the same exact narrative that makes people feel as though there isn't anyone other than Duterte who could fix the viscerality of their problems. Thirdly, they told me people are already turned off by Duterte. If a lot of people have been turned off by Duterte, it is likely true that spending even more time just saying he is bad is just wasting your time more as an opposition party. This means that it is an extremely short-term solution, and therefore they don't actually co-opt any of our long-term benefits, which, by the way, weighs extremely highly in contrast to the opposition case. Finally, they told me at least you can put Sara Duterte in a difficult position, even if you don't win. I'm not sure why this is a particularly important thing, because if the opposition party doesn't win, then you further legitimize him and his constituents as a pretty good solution for the political party, right? So what that means is that OP doesn't have a contingency plan, but we did. What was our contingency plan? I'll talk about three things here. The first is that opposition has never run on a issue-based platform. This strategy is more novel, and people will build a stronger base for you as the opposition party. Secondly, you can't fight against Duterte in the field in which he has a lot of political capital in, as an oligarch that strong-arms like his opponents and outlandish with its narratives overall. But the reason why you have to weigh this, thirdly, is in two different respects. Firstly, this is the largest benefit for the opposition party overall. You must ensure that you get both critical mass and long-term stability. Even if we lose in this election, it'll be good for the long run, as the party shifts their identity to one that caters to the people more and to the urgent issues more. But secondly, we create larger benefits for the party on our side of the house. The people who are likely to rise in the ranks will be issue-based politicians. This would be better for the Philippines generally in two different respects. A, those candidates are the ones who ended up running, and B, voters would expect this more than polarized politics. The prop bench had a contingency plan. We are more likely to win the election. Even if we didn't, we're better off on a value judgment. For all those reasons, prop.
Thank you for that speech. Now calling on Upwhip here.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Luigi. My preferred gender pronouns are he, him, they. If you have any POIs, you can raise it in the chat. I want to chat for all of your POIs. All right. Give me a moment. All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, and go. DPM and GovWhip concede that Duterte is a fundamental threat to democracy. If this is the case, the strategy to disempower Duterte does not rely on agrarian reform, it does not rely on labor reform, or neither does it rely on COVID health responses. It just means we need to stop him from winning. And our coalition, I agree, may be thin. It may not agree on all of the issues, but at least having Duterte out of power is enough. I'm going to talk about three things in this speech. Firstly, on what happens if Duterte wins, on why we have a more unified opposition. Number two, on what is the state of Philippine politics. And lastly, how do we increase chances of success in the Philippine opposition? Firstly, what happens if Duterte wins? So note that DLO, Mikko, makes a very clear argument in his speech that if Duterte wins, then we were able to make the argument that the exact significant pressure and the ability for us to enact resistance against Duterte's leadership while he is in power, the Sara Duterte and Rodrigo Duterte coalition, is premised on our ability to stop individuals from the Liberal Party or the Bayan Muna Party or moderate parties to party hop to the Duterte coalition or the PDP Laban Party so that he has less and less votes, or that they can stop the ability for him to make large-scale changes which are a threat to democracy, like charter change and the ability for him to create federalism, which might enact more and more ways for Duterte to consolidate his power in the long run. Or we can, as I learned in 2016, we can veto many of the vetoes of the President Duterte by having a 2/3 majority in Congress. That's what we're able to do in our model because it is legitimate for us to be able to have a coalition on the basis of an anti-Duterte campaign, because even after an election is done, people are more and more likely to coalesce not back to the Duterte power, but more and more to the opposition to Duterte, so that in the future, in the next midterm elections, we're also able to win more in the Senate and more in the Congress, such that we can disempower Duterte even from his roots, even from within his own party. What is government's response? The government only says that, oh, no, these issues allow us to coalesce and create a resistance against Duterte. I want to know two things. Number one, government does not respond and engage with the fact that they don't change the norms of Philippine politics. They only change it in the sense that the opposition is going to do this on their own, but they don't change the fact that more and more of Duterte supporters is still going to rely on promises for change, on wide-scale reforms or promises like ending contractualization, including federalism, or trying as much as possible to give more and more promises for the war on drugs, because Duterte ran on that campaign is likely to use it again. If this is the case, we said that focusing on the fact that he's already an incumbent of a failed administration is the best way to be able to counteract this. But secondly, if people are disillusioned right now, which GovWhip does concede to, people are disillusioned by Duterte's false promises, and if they concede to this, it is more and more likely that our campaign is going to be more convincing to more and more individuals. That is why we are more likely to be able to offer ourselves a clear alternative, not because we can be bad against Duterte, but we can undo his policies. We can undo many of the Supreme Court justices that he appointed into the Supreme Court, which were Duterte and biased, or for example, we can try as much as possible to undo many of the constitutional changes that he's been threatening in Congress. These are realistic things that we can do to be able to, as much as possible, like demilitarize the war on drugs, try to restore free speech and dissent by taking Laila de Lima out of prison, and these things are moderately what people will agree on and vote on, because this is likely to be a coalition that will succeed. But thirdly, people can forget, and this is also important, right? GovWhip doesn't respond to the fact that historical revisionism is an incentive of Duterte, that he has the incentive to, as much as possible, brainwash the public through propaganda, through social media, to as much as possible sending more and more campaigns and commercials to be able to try as much as possible to falsify his legacy. If this is the case, then we have also the possibility to use the energy and anger that people are feeling right now from their loved ones dying of COVID to create a coalition to at least weaken his legacy and weaken his ability to administer in public, and Sara Duterte's ability to administer in public in the future, because at least Manny Pacquiao is always going to be like, yeah, laban. Number two, how do we, what is the state of Philippine politics? The mechanism government side says and relies on is that the opposition party can coalesce around issues and that their issues-based campaign will resonate with these issues, right? I would note two things that we mentioned here. Number one, Philippine politics operates largely on basis of cult of personality, that there are political dynasties that fund celebrities and strongmen in power, and Duterte's power relies on populist rhetoric that oversimplifies solutions. So obviously this is the root of his power. But the second thing we also noted is that the Philippine opposition significantly does not unify on these issues, so that in the short run, they're unable to create a big enough voting base to beat the 26% of Sara Duterte right now. But we do have a 70% of individuals that are able to be against Duterte. So on our side, we believe we have a greater coalition. So, people disagree on political dynasties, many individuals disagree on labor reforms, etc., etc. What is Government Whip's response? GovWhip only says that you need to fix your own image first as a party, and you need to prove yourself as a better comparative. Number two, I have two things here. Number one, we can undo his policy. This is good enough. We can pull back on the war on drugs. We can pull back on the Hague ruling, and people will be able to rally on this because Duterte significantly failed on being able to campaign on the basis of trying to be anti-China and then going on the rolling the boat and then going to the island and then fighting for our rights. I mean, obviously, that's a way we can try and fight against Duterte. But number two, you can only get compromise if you agree on those solutions. And government side has given us no structured reason. And even it was clear in the Government Whip response to the POI that they don't have an agreement as to what policies they actually will support. And that does show that they are going to be divided as a party and as an opposition, which shows they will never get in power. Take a POI right now, actually.
So your claim is that people will come together and compromise and decide on one leader because everyone hates Duterte. So people have eyes, so they can see status quo as bad, so they'll hate Duterte on both sides. Why can't they therefore also compromise and have broad policies that appease both the agrarian faction and the non-agrarian faction if they hate Duterte so much symmetrically?
If people have eyes, then they have ears. They can hear our cries of anger that show that Duterte is a bad leader. They can also listen and to be able to show that our leadership is going to be good. And we do have viable leaders, right? Like people like Lenny Robredo, Nancy Binay, Carpio, Nery Colmenares. But even if that's not the case, these are individuals from the left and right wing that are willing to at least vote together and say, these are your senators who will vote for the next election. Let's vote them in so that even if Duterte tries to win the presidency, we can undermine that as much as possible. Like, heck, I don't even care if it's Manny Pacquiao that runs into power or Isko Moreno, but it shows that individuals are willing to give up short-term political ambitions if it means that Duterte is willing to win. And Duterte doesn't win in the future so that they can have better prospects for themselves to be able to win another election in the future because they have good political with many of these individuals who are already their allies. We create allyship on this basis. This is a great party that people opt into, and that's why we win. What is DPM's best response to this and government's response? They say Duterte will smear campaign. You smear campaign no matter what, and they can't offer anything. Number one, we can divide Duterte's base too by having a smear campaign as well, which is why our smear campaign is better than Duterte's smear campaign, because Duterte's been doing this for a long time. But our side, we ride with the Manny Pacquiao's of the world. We ride with all of the people that are already going against this, because it's a unified opposition that is already energized today. But the last thing I just want to say is that Duterte supporters are just not brainwashed, right? Obviously, many of these individuals have already been disillusioned, and they're already going towards our side, and that's why we become more and more effective in the future. So, for all these reasons and more, I'm very proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. Now calling on opposition reply here.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Firstly, who wins the election? Because Gov says that a lot of people want to talk issues. Gov has two options though. It is either one, that they have clear solutions for these issues, where all of our critique applies, i.e. that any solution that you pick is likely to alienate and divide the base, that a lot of the solutions you pick are difficult to understand, or that a lot of the solutions that you pick, in comparison to whatever the hell else Duterte comes up with, is not going to come up as clearly or resound as well. Because a lot of the issues, or solutions rather, that the opposition wants to be able to use are slow forms of structural change that are probably smart to do in the Philippines. But these are not the kinds of changes that are going to resonate with the base. These are not the kinds of changes that are going to win them the election. Secondly, well, they could choose not to have a clear solution in order to maintain this kind of unity. But that also just defeats all of their benefits, because they're not going to look like they're solving anything very much. At best, actually, no, about that later. Next thing. GovWeb says, well, if people are already angry at Duterte, this is a waste of time. I just fundamentally disagree. I think we make clear at both DLO and OpWhip that this anger has to manifest in a democratic way. It is by saying that we too are angry, we too oppose Duterte, that you are able to ensure a larger amount of people are going to join and coalesce with this opposition group. So, even if people are angry on both sides of the house, as GovWhip says, is not mutually exclusive, the problem is that a lot of these angry individuals do not join the opposition, do not vote for the opposition come election time, because on Gov, they don't frame themselves as a manifestation of that anger. This is not a waste of time, and in fact, this concession is incredibly big. But secondly, Gov also says we don't want to play the blame game. The problem here is that any of the arguments about changing the norms of Philippine politics is maybe the opposition group no longer does it. The problem is they don't explain why other groups are still not likely to do it. And what we explain is that you will still be blamed for all the structural problems within previous administrations. You will still be blamed as the root cause of the problem. And the difficulty here is that you cannot say, no, it happened during the Duterte administration. No, these are not things you can pin on us anymore. It is utterly defenseless for the opposition to do anything, therefore. The second thing I want to talk about is, I don't think we have to win. And we gave multiple mechanisms in this absolute worst case, such that, number one, I would say it's far better than what Gov argues, because in the instances where they don't win, a lot of their arguments are about changing the norms of Philippine politics, which again, one, don't explain why if the opposition does it, the rest of the country is likely to do it. But two, they don't explain why in this long term, this is likely to be sustained, it's something that's going to change all facets of Philippine politics, versus more clear benefits that we are able to garner as a result of even not winning. Two things. Firstly, we explain why we're more likely to build coalition. I.e., there are many politically ambitious people like Manny Pacquiao who are currently criticizing Duterte and will not agree with you on the issues. They don't agree with you on any of the solutions, but they do agree with you that Duterte has to be out. And what that means is, not only do we get any other alternative compared to Duterte, which we are fundamentally okay with on up, but it also means that it means some degree of concession. I.e., maybe we get more seats in legislation. Maybe they appoint us to some members or positions in cabinet. And therefore, a degree of change is far better than having to rely on the election for any change to happen on Gov. But secondly, they don't respond to our argument on Sara Duterte. And that's important because in this case, where she is president and she is the one in power, Gov has no mechanism to prevent any of the harm that she could wreak. What we explain is that even if she wins, there's an incentive to either maybe just completely remove her father as a running mate and say, I am dissociating, we no longer identify with one another, or at the very least in policy, ensure that you begin to distance yourself. Say that you are a reformer. Say that the promises and the things that your dad did are not the sins you're willing to inherit no longer. And therefore, what that proves is we do not need the political win. We just need enough pressure to ensure that the people in power are willing to dissociate for the long term. In both these cases, opposition wins. Fun debate. Thank you, Gab.
Thank you for that speech. Now, to finally end this debate, Gov reply, here.
Want to be listening to a blame game of who's necessarily responsible, because this could go back decades. What I want to be hearing are issues moving forward and how to recover from these crises. I think that we provided a better case on Gov on two levels. The first is on whether or not we're able to better win the election, and the secondly is on long-term impacts both to both the Filipino political culture, but also if you lose the election. So starting with winning the election, I think that OP themselves have provided a lot of reasons why Duterte's popularity is faltering. So let's say we buy this framework. Then what I think is the best thing to do is not to bring him back into the spotlight. Because if OP's characterization is true and that people tacitly blame him already, then the best thing that you can do is just focus on the issues that he's already failed at, let that tacit association work, and then win these votes. Because like I said in my speech, let people split from Duterte without implicitly blaming them for allowing it all to happen by voting for him a couple years ago. But furthermore, let's say his population isn't faltering and he truly poses an existential threat. He and his daughter pose an existential threat to Filipino democracy. I think that if it is true that this existential threat to democracy is sufficient enough, that these parties will be forced to coalesce. And I think that this undermines, and this provides a tipping point, because I think we're still able to get the kind of broad coalition building around different kinds of issues and broadly agreed upon issues that you don't get, right? Because I think that if they're able to access some kind of compromise around anti-Duterte, I think that we are equally able to create issues that are broad enough that everyone agrees on, like better education, better infrastructure, etc. That you are able to find different kinds of way of messaging these kinds of broader message to their own individual populations while still maintaining a unified front. And what you're able to get from this is you're able to better access compromise, because politicians understand in these parties, they understand the existential threat that is caused, that is providing the incentive to work together and eat some small-term political party line harms. Because as opposition characterizes for us, Duterte ran by running on issues with bad solutions. I think that we can do the same by running on solutions that are better, because as they themselves have said, and as we've explicitly clarified throughout this round, that the solutions that he's come up with have failed. But furthermore, on the hypocrisy of parties, I think that if it's true that this is something that everyone believes, it's also true that Duterte has failed at issues too. In a battle of all the failed, then re-implementing the same ones that have clearly failed you right now. But lastly, I think a lot of people will vote for the pocketbook issues rather than more abstract notions. And I think that the DPM alludes to it, and the government and Prime Minister allude to this when they say that these kinds of issues that people vote on are the ones that matter most to them. But secondly is on long-term impacts. I think that even if they lose, it's important, because Filipino politics requires functioning political parties to work in the long run. These are parties that are able to have functional bureaucrats and are able to have functional party mechanisms that are staffed with people who know what their expertise themselves. This is a long-term change in the way that political parties work to divest themselves from the notion and heritage and reputation that they have as just being an elite little club that's centered around Manila, filled with the kids of oligarchs. But lastly, I think what we have to look at is the worst case scenario in which Duterte wins and who provides the best path forward. Because even if you don't buy any of this, I still think that we provide the best solution in a second Duterte administration. it provides the opposition parties who are focused on issues a way to oppose the administrations, but work with the administrations, even as intolerable as that is, to work with the administration on problems that still matter to millions of Filipino people without incurring the direct retribution of a president who had been blind in the election.
Thank you for that speech. Now, across the house.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks all for the round.
Also, you may now leave the breakout room.